The story you're about to hear is one of the most unsettling chapters ever whispered about in the forgotten lowlands of the American South. Before we begin, I invite you to take a moment and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and the exact time of night this narration reaches you. Your responses help the community of Grave of the Shadows grow, and they show us just how far these buried histories still travel. Our journey takes us to the year 1839, on the outskirts of a town whose records have been rewritten, redacted, and in some cases erased entirely. At the center of this landscape once stood an estate known for its grand columns, polished verandas, and sweeping fields of cotton that shimmered like white fire beneath the summer sun. To the outside world, it was a symbol of prosperity, refinement, and Southern pride. But those who lived and labored behind the facade knew that the soil hid more than roots. It hid secrets, layered, rotting, and heavy enough to bend the truth of anyone who dared to remember them. And buried beneath those secrets was a young woman whose beauty was commented on even in the cold handwriting of ledgers. A woman who entered the estate in the prime of her youth, unaware that she would become entangled in a tragedy so profound that even today, researchers struggle to separate fact from nightmare. She bore the master's children. She buried them before turning 30, and the echoes of her grief still hum beneath the ground where her footsteps once fell. As we step into her story, I ask you to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows. More untold histories await. The estate that once dominated this forgotten stretch of countryside was called Rayfield Manor, a name spoken with pride in its prime and with discomfort in the years that followed. Travelers approaching it in the 19th century would have first seen the towering columns rising from the earth like bleached ribs of some ancient creature. The house itself glowed a soft ivory at dawn, catching the sun with an elegance that suggested wealth, culture, and order. Neatly trimmed hedges lined the walkway, and magnolia trees spread their branches as if curating the breeze. To any outsider, Rayfield Manor appeared serene, untouched by the turmoil that shaped the world beyond its gates. Yet those who lived in the shadow of that elegance knew the truth. Beauty here was a mask, and masks always hide the deepest wounds. Behind the immaculate ballroom with its polished floors, behind the ornamental gardens designed to impress visiting merchants and politicians, lay the quarters where dozens of enslaved men, women, and children endured their days in silence. The contrast was staggering. The wealth displayed in the main house seemed to feed directly off the suffering tucked discreetly out of sight. Servants whispered among themselves about strange footsteps in the halls long after the lamps were out, about voices they couldn't trace, about doors that creaked even when the wind was still. Long before tragedy became undeniable, the estate carried an energy, thick, uneasy, and impossible to ignore. Rayfield Manor was beautiful, yes, but beauty can be a warning, too. Her name, as it first appeared in the surviving records, was Lyria Beaumont. Even the handwriting that documented her arrival at Rayfield Manor seemed unusually careful, as though the clerk feared an imprecise line would inadequately capture the significance of the exchange. She arrived in the winter of 1839, carried by a wagon that pulled up to the back entrance of the estate just before dusk. The ledger noted her age as 22. Nothing else, no birthplace, no family, no personal history. Just a number, a price, and a signature confirming her transfer. But oral accounts passed down through neighboring farms described her differently. They spoke of a young woman with quiet intelligence, a posture that seemed too graceful for the life forced upon her, and eyes that held a depth no one could fully decipher. Some said she rarely spoke. Others claimed she had a soft voice that carried farther than expected on humid nights. There was something about her presence, composed yet distant, that unsettled even the seasoned overseers. Within weeks, Lyria was assigned to duties inside the main house, an unusual elevation for someone newly arrived and with no known connections. Rumors quickly spread that the master of Rayfield Manor, a widower of considerable wealth, had taken an interest in her beyond the ordinary expectations of service. Those who noticed the subtle changes, her placement at certain tasks, the fine cloth she was allowed to handle, the long glances exchanged across candlelit rooms, understood immediately that her life was about to be altered in ways she never could have imagined. And Rayfield Manor, for reasons history would soon reveal, would never be the same again. The master of Rayfield Manor was Cassius Rayfield, a man whose reputation traveled farther than his plantation's borders ever could. He was 46 when Lyria arrived, an age where grief had settled into his bones but ambition still burned through his gestures. Cassius had lost his wife 3 years earlier to a fever that moved too quickly for even the most skilled physicians of Savannah to counter. Those who visited him afterward described a man who operated in two halves, the public gentleman and the private storm. On the surface, he remained polished. He entertained county officials with cordial smiles, invested in expanding his cotton holdings, and donated generously to the local church. But behind the closed doors of Rayfield Manor, something about him had changed. His temper had sharpened. His nights grew restless. Servants whispered that he roamed the hallways until dawn, unable to sleep in the bed he once shared with his wife. When Lyria Beaumont entered the estate, Cassius noticed her immediately. The shift was subtle at first, a request that she serve tea in the dining room rather than work the fields, an order that she be trained in household etiquette, a lingering glance when he thought no one was watching. Yet, to those accustomed to the master's moods, his interest was unmistakable. It wasn't affection. It wasn't kindness. It was possession, quiet, deliberate, and increasingly dangerous. And whatever Cassius Rayfield saw in Lyria that winter would ignite a chain of events that neither he nor the estate was prepared to confront. The first sign that something had changed between Lyria Beaumont and Cassius Rayfield appeared not in conversation, nor in household gossip, but in the estate's expense ledger. It was a single line, dated March 4, 1840, listing the purchase of a copper bathing basin, far too fine a luxury for the quarters behind the kitchen where most enslaved women lived. The next entry was stranger still. Fabric of a higher quality, ordered discreetly from a Savannah merchant who routinely supplied Cassius's late wife. These purchases, when viewed alone, were meaningless, but together, they painted the beginning of a secret taking shape behind polished doors. By early summer, Lyria's figure had changed enough that the house servants exchanged silent glances whenever she passed. No official announcement was made. Cassius Rayfield had no intention of acknowledging what everyone already knew. Instead, he assigned her to tasks that kept her within the walls of Rayfield Manor, dusting the parlor, organizing shelves, arranging flowers for the dining room, anything to keep her out of public view. The estate's physician, Dr. Merrick Holler, began to appear more frequently, arriving at odd hours and entering through the side porch rather than the front steps. His logbook, recovered decades later among the ruins of his nephew's belongings, contained a cryptic notation. Condition in the Rayfield house requires delicacy. Recommended rest. No mention to staff. On December 11, 1840, Lyria gave birth to a daughter. No name was entered in the property records, an omission that researchers would later recognize as the first signal that Cassius intended to hide more than a scandal. Only a brief line in his private journal acknowledged the child's existence. A new life in the house today, quiet, fragile, with her mother's eyes. The secret had begun, and the cost of keeping it would soon become unbearable. For a brief stretch of weeks, the manor felt almost suspended in a fragile peace. Lyria remained in the small room Cassius had arranged behind the kitchen, a space quietly expanded with a rocking chair and a cradle carved by one of the older carpenters on the property. Those who caught glimpses of her daughter, whom Lyria was never permitted to name aloud, saw a delicate infant with unervingly steady eyes and fingers that curled tightly around her mother's sleeve. Lyria rarely smiled, but she hovered over the child with a tenderness that softened even the kitchen staff who had long learned to numb themselves. Then, in late July of 1841, the child fell ill. It began as a faint fever, a warmth that Lyria noticed before anyone else. Within days, the infant's breathing grew shallow, her cries weakened, and her small body trembled as though resisting something no one could see. Cassius summoned Dr. Holler immediately, and his visits grew more frantic by the hour. But the remedies, tonics, herbal compresses, whispered reassurances, did nothing. On August 2nd, the infant died, just shy of 8 months old. What happened next was not normal. Instead of burying the child in the unmarked ground near the workers' quarters, Cassius ordered a small grave dug beneath a sprawling willow tree at the edge of the Rayfield garden. No other burial had ever been permitted there. Lyria was seen kneeling beside the fresh mound long after sunset, motionless, her hands resting on the soil as though listening for something beneath it. Those who saw her said it was the most haunting silence they had ever witnessed, one that clung to the estate for days, heavy and unspoken. Life at Rayfield Manor resumed its quiet routines, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. Lyria moved like a shadow through the halls, silent, obedient, present in body but distant in spirit. Cassius rarely spoke of the first child, and no one dared mention the small grave beneath the willow tree. Yet despite the estate's attempt to smother the tragedy with routine, the house seemed to breathe differently, as if mourning in its own way. By November of 1841, the staff noticed subtle changes in Lyria once again. Her appetite waned. She walked more slowly. She avoided the rear staircase where Cassius frequently lingered. And before long, whispers confirmed what no one dared say aloud. She was with child again. This time, Cassius grew more watchful. According to a caretaker's journal discovered decades later, he forbade Lyria from working in the fields or lifting anything heavier than a washbasin. A lock was installed on her door, not to keep her in but to keep prying eyes out. Or so the overseer claimed. Dr. Haller increased his visits, and his notes, faded, smudged with humidity, recorded delicate circumstances and heightened caution. On June 5, 1842, Lyria delivered a son. Stronger than his sister, louder, with a faint resemblance to Cassius that made some servants uneasy. For a while the child thrived. Lyria carried him close, humming old songs she barely remembered, her voice trembling like a candle flame in the wind. But in March of the following year, the infant developed a harsh cough that worsened by the hour. Dr. Haller tried everything he knew, but the baby's breaths grew ragged and thin. He died on March 12, 1843. Cassius buried him beside his sister, beneath the same willow tree. Lyria planted a cluster of white lilies at the site. She never spoke a word. In the months following the second burial, Lyria Beaumont moved as though her spirit had loosened from her body. Those who worked near her described a strange transformation, one that unfolded not in outbursts or cries, but in silence. She no longer looked anyone directly in the eyes. Her hands trembled when she washed linens. Her voice, once soft but steady, faded until she spoke only when commanded to. Even then, her responses seemed to drift somewhere between obedience and absence. The kitchen staff noted that she often wandered toward the willow tree long after dusk, standing barefoot in the damp grass with her head tilted slightly, as if listening for something beneath the ground. When approached, she would step back quietly, bow her head, and return inside without a word. More than one servant refused to accompany her on nighttime tasks after witnessing these moments. On May 28, 1843, the housekeeper recorded a troubling incident in her private notebook, a faint scream echoing from Lyria's room, followed by a heavy thud. When she and another servant rushed upstairs, they found Lyria collapsed beside her bed, eyes unfocused, hands curled tightly around the corner of a baby's blanket she had kept hidden. Cassius dismissed the episode as exhaustion, ordering everyone to leave her be. But whispers spread quickly. Some claimed grief had taken her mind. Others believed something darker was gnawing at the edges of her sanity. Whatever the cause, Rayfield Manor had begun to feel wrong. Rooms felt colder, nights grew heavier, and Lyria Beaumont seemed to be slipping silently toward a place no one could reach. By the end of summer 1843, the quiet despair that clung to Lyria Beaumont began to shift into something the household could not quite name. Her steps slowed, her frame weakened, and the subtle curve beneath her apron revealed what many feared but expected. She was with child again. No announcement was given. Cassius Rayfield preferred to pretend the inevitable did not exist until it was forced into view. But this time, the estate moved differently. Cassius converted a storage chamber beside his own bedroom into a private birthing room, ordering new linens, candles, and a paneled screen from Savannah. He hired midwife Clara Bexley, a stern woman known for both discretion and skill, to stay on the property for the final weeks. Clara's arrival was noted in the payroll ledger with a single entry, no additional remarks. no reason given. Visitors to Rayfield Manor sensed the tension immediately. One of Cassius's business partners, Frederick Arlo, later recounted in his commercial diary that the master paced the halls like a man awaiting judgment, stepping away from meetings to check on unspecified domestic matters. Even Dr. Haller appeared nervous, arriving twice a day with medicines he refused to label. On February 9, 1844, Lyria gave birth to her third child, a girl Cassius privately named Rosalind. For a short time, the infant thrived. She smiled quickly, grasped Lyria's fingers with determination, and had a laugh so soft it startled the servants who overheard it. But in June, everything changed. Rosalind developed a sudden fever that rose with brutal speed. Dr. Haller administered tonics. Clara Bexley stayed through the night, yet nothing slowed the decline. On June 21st, the child died. Cassius buried her beneath the willow tree with her siblings. Lyria stood beside the grave, unmoving, until the candles burned out. After the third burial, a noticeable shift settled over Rayfield Manor, one that had little to do with grief and everything to do with fear. Cassius Rayfield, once a man who commanded every room he entered, began to unravel in quiet but unmistakable ways. Servants reported hearing him muttering to himself late at night, pacing the upper hallways until the floorboards groaned beneath his steps. He stopped hosting dinners. He stopped attending church. Even the overseer commented, in a letter discovered decades later, that the master watched the house as though hunted by something within it. Rumors spread quickly across neighboring farms. Some whispered that Cassius believed the deaths of the children were divine punishment for his actions. Others claimed he suspected someone in the house, perhaps even Lyria herself, had a hand in their fate. And a few, lowering their voices further, suggested that he feared the spirits of the little ones lingered beneath the willow tree, restless and calling. Dr. Haller was summoned more frequently than ever, though his notes from this period became increasingly vague. One entry read simply, "The master expresses concern regarding the mental state of the household. Cannot determine whether fear is rational or symptomatic." A traveling preacher who stayed briefly at the manor wrote to his brother that Cassius appeared haunted in broad daylight, flinching at shadows, refusing to walk alone, and checking on Lyria's room as if expecting some terrible revelation. Whatever had begun as unspoken scandal was transforming into something else. An invisible pressure tightening around Rayfield Manor, suffocating every attempt to return to normalcy. And Cassius Rayfield, for the first time in his life, seemed genuinely afraid. By the autumn of 1844, the atmosphere inside Rayfield Manor had thickened into something nearly suffocating. Servants tiptoed through hallways, conversations shrank to whispers, and even the ever-present creaking of the old house seemed hesitant, as though the building itself feared what might happen next. In the midst of this growing tension, Lyria Beaumont's fragile frame began to change once more. She was pregnant again. This time, Cassius reacted with a desperation that unsettled everyone. He ordered the sitting room adjoining his bedroom to be converted into a birthing chamber, far grander than anything used for her previous deliveries. The walls were scrubbed, a new iron stove installed for warmth, and fresh linens brought from Charleston. He demanded absolute secrecy, instructing every servant to remain silent about Lyria's condition, threatening dismissal or worse, if a single word left the estate. Dr. Haller visited daily, carrying vials of medicine he guarded like contraband. His notes from this period, later found water-damaged but legible, mention extreme emotional instability and persistent dread from both patient and master. Meanwhile, midwife Clara Bexley returned to the manor, though she kept her reasons for coming hidden even from the staff. As the pregnancy progressed, Lyria grew more detached. Some nights, Clara and Dr. Haller reported finding her staring at her reflection for hours, lips moving soundlessly. Other nights, she refused food, sitting upright in her bed as though sleep itself was dangerous. The estate's gardener later testified, long after Rayfield Manor had fallen into ruin, that he saw Cassius standing beneath the willow tree on several occasions, weeping into his hands like a man begging something unseen for mercy. And as winter approached, everyone within those walls sensed it. Whatever shadow hung over the manor was nearing its breaking point. The night the fourth child entered the world was one that no written record captures fully, yet its fragments haunt every surviving account tied to Rayfield Manor. It was January 28, 1845, a night thick with icy rain that hammered the shutters and drowned the estate in a gray, oppressive stillness. Inside the converted birthing chamber, Clara Bexley worked by candlelight, her hands trembling despite years of experience. Dr. Haller remained close, whispering instructions, his face pale beneath the flickering glow. Cassius Rayfield stood in the corner, knuckles pressed white against the mantelpiece. Sometime before dawn, Lyria delivered a child, a boy. What happened next depends entirely on whom you choose to believe. Clara Bexley later claimed, in a confession found years after her death, that the infant never cried, never opened his eyes, and was cold to the touch before she even wrapped him in cloth. Dr. Haller insisted the child drew at least one breath, faint but real, before slipping away moments later. Cassius, in a single line scrawled in his journal, wrote only, "Born without voice, taken before sunrise." Yet other clues suggest a darker truth. A servant reported seeing Lyria clutching the bundle long after the midwife stepped away, murmuring something soft and unrecognizable. Another claimed Cassius argued fiercely with Dr. Haller behind closed doors, demanding that nothing be recorded, nothing spoken. By mid-morning, Cassius ordered the grave beneath the willow tree prepared once again. No one, not Clara, not the doctor, not the servants, saw the child's face as the small, shrouded form was carried into the garden. And by dusk, Lyria Beaumont had vanished from her room without a trace. When the servants discovered Lyria's empty room on the morning of January 29, 1845, confusion rippled quietly through the manor. Her bed was cold. The blanket she always kept folded at the foot had been left on the floor, as though dropped in haste. A single candle sat burned down to the wick, its wax pooled unevenly, evidence that she had been awake long into the night. At first, the housekeeper assumed she had wandered toward the willow tree again, but the garden was empty, the soil undisturbed, the winter air silent. Cassius Rayfield reacted with a mixture of fury and dread. Rather than alerting authorities, which would have required explaining far more than he wished, he ordered the overseer to conduct a discreet search of the property. Men combed the fields, the woods, the creek bed beyond the eastern pasture, but returned each time with the same report. Nothing. No footprints. No torn fabric. No signs of struggle. On the second night, the overseer expanded the search to neighboring farms, offering a reward for her safe return, but cautioning everyone that the matter was strictly private. Some whispered that Cassius feared scandal. Others believed he feared something far worse, that Lyria had taken the truth about the children with her. 3 days passed before the search ended abruptly. Cassius dismissed his men, locked himself inside his study, and refused to speak for nearly 24 hours. Whatever he found or feared remains unknown. Lyria Beaumont had disappeared, and Rayfield Manor would never be the same again. In the months following Lyria Beaumont's disappearance, Rayfield Manor began to unravel in ways both subtle and unmistakable. Cassius Rayfield withdrew from nearly every aspect of plantation life. The once meticulously managed fields grew patchy from neglect, tools rusted in the sheds, and the crisp routines that had governed the estate for years dissolved into silence. Servants later remarked that Cassius seemed to age a decade in a matter of weeks, drifting through the manor like a man haunted by something only he could see. Business associates noticed the change as well. Letters from this period reveal missed meetings, delayed shipments, and debts quietly accumulating. One merchant wrote that Cassius looked as though a ghost walked a few steps behind him, whispering reminders he could not bear to hear. He stopped attending social gatherings entirely and developed a habit of staring out the window facing the willow tree for hours, unmoving, expression hollow. By 1846, Rayfield Manor had lost nearly half its value. Several enslaved workers were sold off to cover expenses, but even that provided only temporary relief. The once celebrated estate fell into disrepair, its wallpaper peeling, its gardens overgrown, its grand halls echoing with an emptiness that felt almost deliberate. It was as if the house itself was grieving, or warning. When Rayfield Manor finally changed hands in 1851, the new owners, distant cousins of Cassius Rayfield, found the house in a state of unsettling neglect. They planned a full renovation, unaware that their efforts would uncover remnants of a story that had been carefully buried beneath dust, plaster, and time. The first discovery came from a hired carpenter repairing a cracked wall in the upstairs hallway. Behind the paneling, he found a small wooden box containing a faded scrap of linen, a silver button, and a folded slip of paper bearing Cassius's handwriting. She wanders even in silence. No date, no explanation. Months later, while clearing out the old storage attic, workers found a leather-bound ledger belonging to housekeeper Mabel Dorr. Its pages, warped from humidity, held entries written in hurried strokes. Notes about Lyria's fainting spells, about Cassius's growing paranoia, and about strange movements near the willow after midnight. One entry, dated a week before Lyria vanished, read, "He fears the truth like fire. She holds it like ice." A more disturbing artifact surfaced during repairs to the cellar, a rusted tin box sealed with twine. Inside lay a lock of dark hair wrapped in cloth and a crude wooden charm carved in the shape of a woman holding four small bundles. The charm's style matched carvings found among West African spiritual traditions, suggesting Lyria carried more of her lineage with her than Rayfield Manor ever acknowledged. Each discovery deepened the mystery, raising questions scholars still struggle to answer. Rayfield Manor may have tried to silence Lyria Beaumont's story, but the house itself kept whispering. More than a century after Rayfield Manor collapsed into ruin, the story of Lyria Beaumont resurfaced in an unexpected place: the quiet office of a graduate researcher at the University of Georgia. In 1968, a history student named Dr. Evelyn Caro, then only 24 years old, began investigating unexplained disappearances of enslaved women across the Deep South. While combing through county archives, she noticed a repeated pattern: missing entries, redacted pages, and whispered references to the Rayfield woman. Intrigued, Caro traveled to the abandoned estate site. By then, the manor had been reduced to scattered stones and overgrown vines. But local residents still spoke of the land in hushed tones. One elderly man, whose grandfather had worked the property, told her, "That place never forgot her. Not once." Caro soon unearthed fragments of correspondence between Cassius Rayfield and a merchant in Charleston, hinting at a private sale arranged in early 1845, just days after Lyria vanished. The bill of sale listed a female servant, age 27, infirm, transferred quietly to a plantation near Baton Rouge. Caro believed this woman was Lyria, but the Louisiana records had been destroyed in a courthouse fire during the Civil War. Her published thesis suggested a chilling possibility. Lyria Beaumont did not die at Rayfield Manor. She may have been sold to silence her. And whatever truly happened to the fourth child was concealed, not by time, but by deliberate, calculated hands. This theory reignited interest in Rayfield's darkest secret, setting the stage for discoveries yet to come. In 1994, long after Dr. Evelyn Caro research rekindled interest in the Rayfield story, a commercial development company purchased the land where the manor once stood. Before construction could begin, county guidelines required a basic archaeological survey of the area. The team assigned to the project expected little, perhaps a few pottery shards, maybe foundation stones from the demolished house. Instead, they found something far stranger. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a small subsurface anomaly near the remains of the old willow tree, a rectangular chamber roughly 6 feet deep, aligned not with the manor's original architecture, but with the burial site Cassius had chosen for the children. When the chamber was carefully opened, the archaeologists discovered a wooden chest, badly deteriorated yet still intact enough to protect its contents. Inside lay 4 cloth dolls, each a different size, arranged in a neat row. Their stitching was uneven, their features minimal, but their symbolism unmistakable. A child's knitted cap lay beside them, its wool nearly dissolved. Beneath these items was a hand-copied page from a prayer book, the ink blurred yet legible enough to make out one line: "Deliver the innocent from suffering." Most chilling was a slim journal bound in faded cloth. Though water damage had erased large portions of its pages, several entries remained readable. The handwriting matched that found on the wooden charm discovered years earlier, believed to belong to Lyria Beaumont herself. One surviving passage dated 1841 read, "The tree listens. The ground remembers. My children return to the quiet where pain cannot reach them." The discovery sent shockwaves through local historians. Whatever happened at Rayfield Manor had left physical echoes, and now the land itself was giving them back. Today, the land where Rayfield Manor once stood bears little resemblance to the world Lyria Beaumont knew. The willow tree is gone, replaced by a narrow strip of pavement that cuts across the edge of a modern parking lot. The manor's grand columns, once symbols of power and wealth, have long since crumbled into dust. Yet those who visit the site often speak of an unmistakable heaviness in the air, a quiet sorrow that lingers like a breath held too long. Historians continue to debate the truth behind Lyria's story. Was she a mother driven to desperate choices by a world determined to crush her? Or a victim caught in the violent grip of a man whose fear outweighed his humanity? The records conflict, the testimonies contradict one another, and the artifacts offer only fragments of a life lived in shadows. But one truth remains constant. Lyria Beaumont existed. She suffered. She loved her children fiercely, and the world denied her even the dignity of being remembered. Now, in the echo of her story, there is a kind of reclamation, a gentle, persistent insistence that her voice deserves to be heard, even if only in whispers carried across generations. In the absence of justice, remembrance becomes its own form of defiance. And in remembering her, we honor every life history tried to erase. Some stories fade when time buries their names. Others linger not through records or dates, but through the weight they leave behind. The tale of Lyria Beaumont is one woven from loss, silence, and unspoken truths. Yet even in fragments, it reaches us across nearly 2 centuries. Perhaps that is the real haunting. Not the whispers at the willow tree or the artifacts hidden beneath the earth, but the reminder that suffering, when ignored, has a way of echoing long after its witnesses are gone. If her footsteps were ever heard again on this land, they would not be asking for fear. They would be asking for memory. Thank you for walking this path with me tonight. If you wish to hear more forgotten histories and unsettling truths, subscribe to Grave of the Shadows, and share in the comments what part of Lyria's story stayed with you the longest. Shadows remember, and now so do we.